Joining us is Thomas Joscelyn, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and Senior Editor at the Long War Journal. Thomas, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
You know, we've heard about this, and now there is a little bit more credibility to what seemed just like one of our most fearful fantasies.
You talking about the Khorasan group in Syria and the intelligence reports that's come out of there? Yeah, sure. What's been going on here is obviously all the jihadist groups, whether it be Al-Qaeda or its branches in Syria or elsewhere, or of course the Islamic State, have all been recruiting foreigners, especially people from the West. And the big fear is, of course, that some small number of them are going to come home and actually execute a sort of a large-scale terrorist attack. And you saw over the last couple of days, there was a great article by Stuart Bell in the National Post talking about the Khorasan group in Syria. And there's been a lot of really, I'd say, mixed-up reporting about the Khorasan group. Stuart gets it exactly right, I think, in terms of what the Khorasan group is. It's a veteran cadre of Al-Qaeda operatives who are operating in Syria, who have been recruiting and trying to find Westerners, including potentially Canadians, to commit attacks back in the West.
All right. So this particular group are doing this, and this report, as you say, from Stuart Bell, says that, this faction has already completed this, and apparently the membership is very secretive. What do we know about who they are and how they rank in the terrorist world?
Well, we've been tracking, before it was called publicly the Khorasan Group, at the Long War Journal, we've been tracking the guys who lead this organization within Al-Qaeda for some time. And they were guys who were basically redeployed from various areas to Syria to lead this effort. And some of them actually led Al-Qaeda's network inside Iran for a number of years, which is very strange. And actually, this is one of the more curious relationships in all this that I can't even explain, which is that Iran apparently allowed very senior Al-Qaeda operatives who were operating inside Iran, on Iranian soil, to go to Syria to help lead Al-Qaeda's efforts there, where, of course, Al-Qaeda is battling the Assad regime, which is backed by Iran. So it's very, very, very odd, and I don't know why they allow them to do this, but the facts of the matter are that they did. And these guys all relocated from Iranian soil to Syria, and they've been leading this charge. And some of these guys have really experience going back more than a decade in planning spectacular terrorist attacks.
Have they, I guess they've been on the radar of intelligence for some time, and then this report in the National Post by Stuart Bell says that, they may have already been successful, and these bomb experts could be living right next to us.
Yeah, there's a fear that these guys could redeploy. Part of the problem right now, the way I would describe it for security services, whether it be the intelligence services or counterterrorism officials who have their eyes overseas, or people who are interested in sort of homeland security, either in Canada or the U.S., here back in the West, is that there's just a flood of data right now on this stuff. And the problem is that it's hard to separate the signal from the noise, to figure out. There are a lot of sympathizers online. There are a lot of people who are sort of clamoring for action but aren't necessarily a real threat. And the problem here is that with all that going on, that there's a heightened risk that one or two or a handful of more trained operatives, guys who not only have the desire to do something really bad, but actually have the capacity to do something really bad, could slip through the cracks and do it. And I think that's the game, that's the fight right now, unfortunately, that Western counterterrorism officials find themselves in.
What about the leadership and the tussle for the leadership? What does it tell us about how serious they are?
Are you talking about between ISIS and Al-Qaeda for leadership of the
No, within the Khorasan group.
Well, within the Khorasan group, I think they have, I think they're a unified entity within Al-Qaeda. They're part of what they actually take their name after is there's this Shura Council, which is an elite advisory council within Al-Qaeda, which takes its name of the Khorasan, which is sort of this almost mythical region that encompasses much of South and Central Asia. And a lot of the veterans that had fought for Al-Qaeda or served in a leadership capacity for Al-Qaeda in the Khorasan were redeployed to Syria under the command of this one group. And there's always some internal rivalries within Al-Qaeda and other organizations, but they do maintain a unified structure. And the big problem here is that this Khorasan group of Al-Qaeda, they play two different roles. They're both interested in attacking the West, of course, but they're also helping to lead the charge against the Assad regime in Syria right now. And my big fear over the long run is I think that as these organizations get bigger and stronger in terms of their insurgency capabilities, they also have more resources to devote to something in the West. And that's, I think, the big fear here.
And they are getting bigger and stronger.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the story I think that a lot of people have missed is that over, obviously a lot of the media is focused on ISIS and Islamic State because of their barbarity and their grotesque acts of violence, and totally understandable. They've had lightning advances since last year. They've controlled a ton of territory, and they have an army. So it's totally understandable the media spends a lot of attention and focus on that. But that doesn't mean that al-Qaeda is out of the game. And there was this sort of assumption that was embedded in a lot of the reporting going back to last year that al-Qaeda had been surpassed. But actually, if you go to January 1st of this year, I think it's indisputable that al-Qaeda and its allies in Syria, for example, have actually conquered more territory or had bigger victories than ISIS has, in Islamic State, or ISIS as it's called. And that's sort of the untold story here, that al-Qaeda has actually been gaining steam in Syria and elsewhere.
Wow, yeah, and we focusing totally on ISIS. All right, they must be focusing on ISIS as well, watching the ground that they're covering. What is the clash between them? Is it in the future a way they may collaborate, or are they separate entities?
I think it's possible. Part of the thing to remember here is that ISIS started off as a regional branch of al-Qaeda and was disowned by al-Qaeda senior leadership because they basically wouldn't follow orders, and they were doing things that al-Qaeda senior leadership didn't want them to do. And that caused big problems, obviously, for al-Qaeda, and it ended up becoming a rivalry between ISIS and al-Qaeda.
Yeah, in many ways there were reports they thought they were almost too brutal, and I don't know what they think about that now. Now that they're on the radar, in the last few days, we have been talking about whether or not the war, President Barack Obama, the United States and allies, whether or not they're winning this war against ISIS, considering the gains that have been made by ISIS, and now this report, can I ask you your opinion? Should we be doing more?
Well, I think we should be doing more. I think, the whole debate over what the West should be doing in all this is, of course, framed by the fiasco of the Iraq War and sort of the failures there, and sort of the perception that has been going on since 2001, and so this is an awfully long time to be at war, and I understand that. I mean, it's sort of, there's a great desire to just sort of call the 9/11 wars to be over with, but the problem is that I think in the West we don't really understand our enemy's mindset, and one of the things we come back to, in fact, our website's called the Long War Journal for a reason. These guys think in terms of a long war. They're primarily insurgents who are trying to wage guerrilla warfare to acquire territory, and that includes al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda actually controls territory. It's, again, not very well understood, but al-Qaeda does actually control a lot of territory across several different countries at this point. And so the point is that they're still in the fight very much this long after 9/11, and our enemies get a vote. And the problem is that basically the West doesn't really understand how they're organized or what they're all about, and so therefore there really is no strategy at this point to defeat them.
No, there isn't. And what is going to take us to that point? Because you've kind of nailed it. I mean, there is that haunting of the Iraq War. And then there are, some people speaking out, and just like you did, and saying we can't let that stop us. Who's winning the war of ideas over here?
Yeah, I think the problem is that, the enemy gets a vote, and you have to sort of look at things realistically in terms of a big picture of what's going on. And, there's a lot of really misinformation about what's going on, because this isn't, on the al-Qaeda side, to be frank, a lot of the counterterrorism analysis is really, really bad. This is something I talk about in public, and people are shocked to hear this. But, think of it this way. The CIA, prior to the raid in Abbottabad to kill Osama bin Laden, assumed that Osama bin Laden wasn't in control of al-Qaeda, that he had given up operational day-to-day control of al-Qaeda. And yet after the raid, when they find this 1.4 or 1.5 million documents and files in bin Laden's compound, they realize that quite a few of them are operational, and then in fact their assumption was wrong. The CIA has admitted that basically bin Laden was very much in charge of day-to-day operations of al-Qaeda. But, take a step back for a second and think about that. That's an awfully big thing to get wrong. I mean, this is a fundamental assumption about what our enemies are doing. This is a guy, bin Laden, who had been hunted for almost 10 years post 9/11, and certainly years before that there were efforts, furtive efforts to go get him before that. And, yet the CIA and the top intelligence officials in the West basically just totally missed that he was still in charge of his international network. I think that's a good example to use for people to understand that there are still a lot of big gaps in sort of the West's understanding of what's actually going on. And, we're seeing now, whether it be with al-Qaeda's gains in Syria or with ISIS, U.S. Intelligence officials, certainly military officials, consistently underestimate these guys and just don't really understand what they're about.
Yeah. Now, is there also a political aspect of that as the United States is heading into a presidential election? Hillary has come out and said she's sorry she voted for Iraq, and there we go. That is just hanging around and won't go away.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly frames everything, but, I think it's very telling that if you look at President Obama's history here, he was against the Iraq war initially, of course, and then he was against the surge in Iraq, which I think is indisputable. If you look at the record there, it actually did turn the tide. And then he was all for pulling all the American troops out of Iraq. And we were the ones basically at the time saying, look, whether you were for the original invasion in Iraq or not, you can't pull all of our troops out now. You have to fight for Status Forces Agreement in 2011 to keep some small contingent there, even 25, 30,000 sort of fighters with support networks. Troopers with their support staff would really make a big difference. And there was such a sort of drive to correct the wrong of the original Iraq war and basically say, well, there's this big wrong-headed decision to go in Iraq in the first place. We're just going to get out now, that it wasn't making a decision based on what was going on the ground then and there. And that was really the mistake. Instead of saying, look, we have to deal with how things are right now, even if we disagree with what happened in 2003, and we have to make decisions based on what's going on right now. And the problem is the decisions weren't made that way. And, in fact, all the troops were pulled out. And I think ISIS's rise was preventable in a number of ways, but particularly because if American troops had been left there 25 to 50,000 or even less, that would have made a big difference, I think, in sort of the fight.
Yeah, and that is going to be fought over in the next few years of what went wrong and who's to blame for that. Well, Thomas, thank you. It was wonderful to have you on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thomas Joscelyn, he's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he's also a senior editor at the Long War Journal.